"You should not be sitting here." The words slipped from the hostess in a sharp whisper, just loud enough for Sophie Bennett to hear as she lowered her fork and looked toward the entrance. A man stood there, his coat worn thin, his shoes scuffed by miles of sidewalks, his presence unsettling the polished calm of the restaurant. Conversations dimmed. Eyes turned. Someone laughed under their breath. The manager stepped forward with a tight smile that did not reach his eyes, already preparing to send the man away. Sophie felt something twist in her chest. It was not pity. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you know exactly what it feels like to be one step away from being told you do not belong. The man did not argue. He simply nodded once, as if he had expected this, and turned slightly toward the door. That was the moment Sophie made her decision. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Sophie pushed her chair back, the soft scrape against the floor cutting through the silence, and lifted her voice just enough to carry across the room. "You can sit here." Every head turned. The manager froze mid-step. The man paused, glancing back at her with quiet confusion, as if he was not sure he had heard correctly. Sophie forced a small smile, steady but unshaken, and gestured to the empty chair across from her table. "It is just a seat," she said, her voice calm even as her pulse began to race. The room shifted. Disapproval hung in the air like smoke. A couple at the next table exchanged looks. The waiter hesitated near the kitchen entrance, unsure whether to approach or retreat. But Sophie did not look away. The man studied her for a long second, then walked slowly toward the table, each step measured, deliberate, almost careful. Up close, he did not smell like the streets the way people expected. There was something clean about him, something composed beneath the rough edges. He sat down without a word, his posture straight, his eyes observant, taking in the room as if he belonged there more than anyone else. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was steady, educated, nothing like the broken tone people had assumed. Sophie blinked, caught off guard, then nodded once as she picked up her glass, suddenly aware that something about this moment did not match the story everyone else had already written for him. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass, but inside, something had already begun to shift, something invisible yet undeniable, like the first crack in a carefully built illusion. The silence at the table did not last long, but it stretched just enough to make every sound in the room feel louder than it should have been. The faint clink of silverware, the low hum of conversations trying to pretend nothing unusual was happening, the soft shuffle of shoes as staff lingered a little too close, watching. Sophie Bennett picked up her fork again, but she did not eat. Her attention stayed on the man across from her. On the way, he sat with quiet composure, as if the weight of every stare in the room meant nothing at all. Most people, in his position, would have hunched their shoulders, avoided eye contact, tried to disappear. He did the opposite. He looked around calmly, taking in details, not with curiosity, but with awareness, as if he had seen rooms like this 1,000 times before. "You do not have to stay if this makes things harder for you," Sophie said softly, her voice careful, almost apologetic. The man shook his head once, a faint smile touching his lips. "I have been asked to leave places for far less," he replied. "This is already more kindness than I expected tonight." His tone was steady, measured, each word clear and deliberate. Sophie felt that same flicker of unease again, not fear, but something harder to name. "You do not sound like someone who expects very little," she said before she could stop herself. He met her eyes then, really met them, and for a brief moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade. "People learn to expect exactly what they are shown," he said. "And tonight, you chose to show something different." Sophie swallowed, unsure how to respond, and reached for a glass instead. Around them, the tension had not eased. A couple at a nearby table whispered behind raised menus. A man in a pressed suit glanced over with open disapproval, shaking his head slightly as if witnessing something improper. Near the entrance, the manager stood with his arms crossed, watching the situation unfold, clearly debating whether to intervene again. The waiter who had been assigned to Sophie's table approached slowly, his expression tight, his steps hesitant. He stopped just short of the table, his eyes flicking between Sophie and the man seated across from her. "Are you ready to order?" he asked, though his tone lacked the usual warmth. Sophie nodded, grateful for the distraction, and began to speak, but before she could finish, the man across from her closed the menu gently and set it aside. "I will have the grilled salmon," he said, his voice calm, confident, without hesitation. No scanning of prices, no uncertainty, no second-guessing. The waiter blinked, caught off guard, then scribbled quickly onto his pad. "And for you, ma'am," he asked, turning back to Sophie. She placed her order, but her focus had shifted completely. There was something about the way he had spoken, the ease, the certainty, the quiet authority that did not match the worn edges of his appearance. When the waiter left, Sophie leaned back slightly, studying him more closely now. "You come here often?" she asked, half teasing, half serious. The corner of his mouth lifted again, just barely. "Often enough to know the salmon is better than the steak," he replied. Sophie let out a small breath of laughter despite herself, but the question lingered in her mind. Before she could ask anything else, a subtle shift rippled through the room. It started near the front, a change in posture, a straightening of backs, a sudden alertness among the staff. The manager, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward quickly now, smoothing his jacket, his expression transforming into something almost deferential. The waiter returned, but this time his steps were different, faster, more precise. He stopped at their table, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes met the man across from Sophie with unmistakable recognition. His posture changed instantly. His shoulders squared, his voice lowered, respectful in a way that felt entirely out of place just moments ago. "Good evening, sir," he said quietly. The word hung in the air like a spark in dry grass. Conversations around them faltered. The couple at the next table went silent. Even the man in the pressed suit looked up again, this time not with judgment, but confusion. Sophie felt her breath catch as she turned slowly toward the man sitting across from her. The same man everyone had dismissed minutes ago. The same man she had invited to share a table. He did not react immediately. He simply looked at the waiter, then gave a small nod, as if this moment, this shift, had always been inevitable. And suddenly, nothing in the room felt the same anymore. The word "sir" did not fade. It settled into the space between them, heavy and undeniable, changing the temperature of the entire room in a single breath. Sophie Bennett felt it before she fully understood it, a shift so sudden it made her pulse quicken. The man across from her remained exactly as he had been, composed, steady, as if nothing unusual had just happened, but everything around him had changed. The waiter stood straighter now, his earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a careful respect that bordered on nervousness. The manager approached quickly, almost too quickly, his expression no longer guarded but attentive, eager, as though trying to correct a mistake that had already been made. "Mr. Cole," the manager said, his voice lowered, respectful, carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. "We were not aware you would be visiting tonight. Please accept our apologies for any inconvenience." The name landed like a second shock. Sophie turned back toward the man, her mind racing, trying to connect the pieces that suddenly felt obvious and impossible at the same time. Cole. The name stirred something familiar, something she had heard before, maybe in passing, maybe on a news segment playing quietly in the background of her apartment after a long shift. The man she had invited to sit across from her met the manager with a calm, almost indifferent glance. "There is no inconvenience," he said simply. His tone was not warm, but it was not harsh either. It was controlled, measured, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard. The manager nodded quickly, relief flashing across his face. "Of course, sir. Your private dining room is prepared upstairs if you would prefer more comfort." The offer hung in the air, an invitation back into the world the man clearly belonged to. But he did not move. Instead, he glanced briefly at Sophie, then back at the manager. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried. Sophie felt her breath catch again, this time not from confusion, but from the weight of what those words implied. Around them, The restaurant had transformed. The same people who had looked at him with dismissal now watched with curiosity, even admiration. The couple who had whispered before now leaned subtly closer, trying to hear every word. The man in the pressed suit straightened his posture, suddenly aware of his own place in the room. Sophie's mind struggled to keep up with the shift. Just minutes ago, she had seen a man being asked to leave. Now she was sitting across from someone the entire staff treated with unmistakable respect. "You are not who they thought you were," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, though it felt loud in her own ears. The man looked at her again, and this time there was something softer in his expression, something almost thoughtful. "No," he said, "but neither are you." Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the response. "I'm exactly who they think I am," she said, a small edge slipping into her voice. "A woman who works double shifts, who counts every dollar, who probably does not belong here either." He studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing her words, then shook his head slightly. "They saw someone who made a decision without asking what it would cost her," he said. "That is not something most people in this room would do." Sophie felt the words settle deeper than she expected. Before she could respond, the waiter returned once more, placing their drinks down with careful precision, his hands steady but deliberate. "If there's anything you need, sir, please let me know," he said, his tone respectful, almost deferential. The man nodded once, then looked back at Sophie, as if the rest of the room no longer existed. "My name is Alexander Cole," he said, finally offering what had been hidden in plain sight all along. "And tonight, I was hoping to learn something I cannot find in a boardroom." Sophie held his gaze, her heart still racing, the world around her feeling distant, unreal. "And what is that?" she asked. Alexander leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but his voice carried a quiet certainty. "The truth about people," he said, "and whether kindness still exists when no one is watching." In that moment, Sophie realized that the decision she had made just minutes ago was no longer small. It had become something else entirely, something that was about to change far more than just one evening. The air between them shifted again, but this time it was quieter, deeper, no longer driven by shock, but by something far more unsettling, something that made Sophie Bennett feel as if she had stepped into a conversation she did not fully understand yet could not walk away from. Around them, the restaurant had resumed its rhythm, but it was a different rhythm now, more careful, more aware, as if every movement was being measured against the presence of the man sitting across from her. Alexander Cole did not look at the room anymore. His attention remained on Sophie, steady, patient, as if he had all the time in the world, as if nothing outside this table mattered. "You were testing them," Sophie said slowly, her voice finding its footing again. "The staff, the customers, everyone." Alexander tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "Not them," he replied. "People." The distinction was subtle, but it carried weight. Sophie leaned back slightly, folding her arms, trying to regain a sense of control in a situation that had already slipped far beyond her expectations. "And what exactly were you hoping to find?" she asked. "Someone who would treat a stranger like a human being without needing a reason," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something that suggested this was not the first time he had asked that question and not the first time he had been disappointed by the answer. Sophie let out a small breath, glancing down at the table before looking back up at him. "That seems like a low bar," she said. "It should be," Alexander replied. "But it rarely is." The waiter returned with their meals, placing the plates carefully, his movements precise, almost rehearsed. The grilled salmon was set in front of Alexander, the presentation flawless, the aroma rich and warm. Sophie's dish followed, but she barely noticed it. Her focus stayed on the man across from her, on the way he carried himself, on the quiet authority that no longer needed to hide. "You did not have to do this," she said after a moment. "You could have just asked." Alexander gave a faint smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes. "People behave differently when they think they are being watched," he said. "The truth shows itself when they believe no one important is paying attention." Sophie felt that settle somewhere deep, uncomfortably close to something she did not want examined too closely. "And what happens now?" she asked. "You found what you were looking for." Alexander picked up his fork, cutting into the salmon with practiced ease, his movements unhurried. "Did I?" he said, glancing up at her again. The question lingered, unanswered. Sophie frowned slightly, confused. "You said you were looking for kindness," she pressed. "And you found it." Alexander set his fork down, his gaze steady, searching. "I found a moment," he said. "One decision. But I have learned that moments can be deceiving." Sophie felt a flicker of irritation now, mixed with something else, something more personal. "You think I was pretending?" she asked, her voice tightening. "No," he said immediately. "But I think people are more complicated than a single choice." The words were not accusatory, but they carried a challenge. Sophie straightened in her seat, her pride pushing back. "I did not invite you to sit here because I thought you were important," she said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Alexander held her gaze, unflinching. "Then prove that it was not just a moment," he said quietly. The sentence landed with unexpected force. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. "Prove it how?" she asked. Alexander leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "By letting this decision mean something after tonight," he said. "Not just for me, for you." The restaurant noise seemed to fade again, not completely, but enough to make the space between them feel more intimate, more charged. Sophie stared at him, trying to understand what he was asking, what he was offering, and what it might cost her. "You're asking a lot from someone you just met," she said finally. Alexander shook his head once, almost gently. "No," he said. "I'm asking for the same thing you already gave." The difference was, now it was no longer invisible. And Sophie realized, with a slow, steady certainty, that whatever came next would not be as simple as offering a seat at a table. It would require something far more difficult, something that could not be undone once it began. The challenge lingered between them long after the last word left Alexander Cole's lips, settling into Sophie Bennett's chest like something heavy and unfamiliar, something that refused to be ignored. She looked down at her plate, finally taking a small bite, but the taste barely registered. Her thoughts were elsewhere, circling the quiet intensity in his voice, the way he had turned a simple act into something that now felt like a test she had not agreed to take. Around them, the restaurant continued to move, but Sophie could feel the difference in how the staff treated their table now. The waiter returned more frequently, attentive in a way that bordered on careful observation, as if every gesture mattered. A glass refilled before it was empty, a plate adjusted without being asked. It was subtle, but it was constant. Sophie noticed. Alexander noticed more. "You see it, do not you?" he said without looking up, his fork moving with calm precision. Sophie paused, then nodded slowly. "They are treating you differently," she said. Alexander lifted his gaze, meeting hers. "No," he replied. "They are revealing how they choose to treat people when they believe it matters." Sophie felt a quiet discomfort settle in her chest. And before she asked, her voice softened now, what did it matter then? Alexander did not answer right away. He set his fork down, his eyes shifting briefly toward the room, toward the staff, toward the people who had already rewritten their judgment in the span of minutes. Before, he said finally, it did not matter to them. That difference, small as it may seem, changes everything. Sophie leaned back slightly, her fingers wrapping around her glass, grounding herself in something tangible. "I did not think about it like that," she admitted. "Most people do not," Alexander said. "That is why it continues." The words were not harsh, but they carried a quiet truth that made Sophie uneasy. She glanced around the restaurant, really looked this time at the polished surfaces, the carefully curated atmosphere, the people dressed in confidence and comfort. Then she thought about how quickly that same room had turned cold just minutes earlier. It was not the place that had changed. It was the perception, and that realization stayed with her. "You said moments can be deceiving," she said slowly. "Maybe they are, but they're also where everything starts." Alexander watched her closely now, as if measuring something beyond her words. "And what happens after the moment?" he asked. Sophie hesitated, then answered honestly. "That depends on the person," she said. "Some forget. Some move on. and some do not. Alexander's expression shifted slightly, something almost approving passing through his gaze before it settled again. The difference, he said, is what I am interested in. Sophie felt the weight of that statement, the implication behind it. But before she could ask more, a quiet disturbance near the entrance drew attention again. A young couple had been stopped by the hostess, their clothes simple, their hesitation obvious. They stood uncertainly, exchanging glances, already preparing for rejection before it was spoken. Sophie noticed immediately. So did Alexander. Neither of them said anything at first. The moment stretched. The same kind of moment that had started everything earlier. Sophie's heart began to beat a little faster. She recognized the pattern now, the invisible line that separated who was welcomed and who was not. She looked at Alexander, then back at the couple, then down at her table. The empty chair beside her felt suddenly significant again. You see, Alexander said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear, is never just one moment. There's always another. Sophie inhaled slowly, her decision forming before she fully realized it. She pushed her chair back slightly and raised her hand, catching the hostess's attention before the situation could resolve itself the way it usually did. They can sit here, she said, her voice steady, echoing her earlier words, but carrying more intention this time. The hostess hesitated, clearly unsure, her eyes flicking toward the manager for direction. Sophie did not look away. This time, it was not about impulse. It was a choice she understood. Alexander watched her, silent, but there was no mistaking the shift in his expression now. This was no longer a single act of kindness. It was something deeper, something that could not be dismissed as coincidence. And as the couple slowly approached the table, still unsure, still cautious, Sophie realized that whatever this night had begun, it was only just unfolding. The hesitation in the room did not disappear when the young couple reached the table. It followed them, clinging to every step they took, visible in the way the woman held her purse tightly against her side, and the way the man kept glancing toward the exit, as if preparing to leave at the first sign of rejection. Sophie Bennett offered a gentle smile, gesturing toward the empty chairs with quiet reassurance. You are welcome here, she said, her voice steady, grounded in a certainty that had not been there earlier in the evening. The couple exchanged a brief look before sitting down carefully, almost as if they were afraid the invitation might be taken back. Thank you, the woman said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Sophie nodded, her attention fully present now, no longer divided by uncertainty. Across from her, Alexander Cole watched in silence, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, taking in every detail of the interaction unfolding in front of him. This was no longer about a single act. This was a pattern, a continuation, a decision made with awareness rather than instinct. The waiter approached again, but this time his composure faltered slightly. His gaze shifted between Alexander and the newly seated couple, uncertainty creeping back into his posture. For a brief moment, it was clear he did not know how to behave, which standard to follow, which version of service applied. Sophie noticed the hesitation and spoke before it could turn into discomfort. They will order as well, she said calmly, removing any ambiguity. The waiter nodded quickly, adjusting his stance, though the tension remained. As menus were handed out, the couple looked down at them with visible hesitation, their eyes scanning prices first, not descriptions. Sophie recognized that instinct immediately. She had done the same countless times. You do not have to rush, she said gently. Take your time. The man gave a small nod, grateful but still cautious. Across the table, Alexander leaned back slightly, observing the exchange with quiet focus. You changed the conditions, he said after a moment, his voice low enough to remain between them. Sophie glanced at him. No, she replied. I just made sure they were the same for everyone. Alexander's gaze lingered on her, something shifting again beneath the surface, something deeper than curiosity now. The room, however, had not fully accepted the change. A few tables away, a woman whispered sharply to her companion, her expression disapproving, her eyes flicking towards Sophie's table with open judgment. The manager remained near the entrance, watching closely, his posture tense, clearly weighing the impact of what was happening. This was no longer just a private moment. It was becoming visible. It was becoming disruptive, and that made it dangerous. The meals continued, conversation at the table slowly easing as Sophie asked simple questions, guiding the couple into a sense of normalcy. "Where are you visiting from?" she asked, her tone light, inviting. The woman hesitated before answering, then spoke quietly about a long drive, about a delayed plan, about stopping here, because it was the only place still open. The details were small, ordinary, but they carried a weight Sophie understood. She listened fully, not out of obligation, but because she chose to, and that choice, repeated, began to shift something not just at the table, but in the space around it. Alexander noticed. He noticed the way the couple's shoulders relaxed slightly, the way their voices grew steadier, the way the tension that had followed them into the restaurant began to fade. He also noticed the resistance in the room, the discomfort from those who believed certain lines should not be crossed. "You are creating friction," he said quietly. Sophie looked at him, unafraid. "Maybe the friction was already there," she replied. "People just chose not to see it." Alexander held her gaze, and for the first time since revealing himself, there was no distance in his expression, only recognition, the kind that does not come from status or power, but from understanding. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the staff, but between the two of them. What had started as an observation was becoming something else, something intentional, something that could not be undone. And as the night moved forward, Sophie realized that she was no longer reacting to the situation. She was shaping it, and Alexander was no longer just watching. He was beginning to believe. The shift between them did not happen all at once. It built slowly, almost quietly, in the spaces between words, in the way Alexander Cole no longer looked at Sophie Bennett as an interesting exception, but as something far more rare, something that challenged the assumptions he had carried for years without realizing it. The restaurant continued around them, but now it felt like a backdrop rather than the center of attention. What mattered was, at the table, the young couple had begun to relax, their voices steadier, their posture no longer guarded, and Sophie remained fully engaged, asking small questions, listening with genuine interest, creating a space where they did not feel out of place. Alexander watched this carefully, not just the actions, but the consistency. "You did not hesitate the second time," he said after a while, his voice calm but thoughtful. Sophie glanced at him briefly. "I understood what it meant this time," she replied. "That made it easier." Alexander leaned back slightly, considering her answer. "Most people find it harder when they understand the consequences," he said. Sophie gave a small, almost tired smile. "Most people are trying to protect something," she said. "Their image, their comfort, their place in the room." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in focus. "And you're not?" he asked. Sophie hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered honestly. "I am," she said. "I just decided it was not worth more than someone else's dignity." The words settled between them with quiet weight. Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her as if seeing her more clearly now, beyond the surface, beyond the moment, into something that could not be easily categorized or dismissed. Around them, the tension had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer sharp or openly critical. It was watchful, curious. People were observing, not just reacting, and that observation carried its own kind of pressure. The manager approached again, this time with a different energy, controlled but deliberate. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, his voice respectful but edged with concern, "perhaps we should relocate you to ensure your comfort." Alexander did not even look at him this time. "I am comfortable," he said simply. The manager hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but something in Alexander's tone made him stop. He nodded once and stepped back, though his presence remained close, monitoring, waiting. Sophie watched the exchange, then turned back to Alexander. "You're not just testing kindness," she said quietly. "There is more to this." Alexander met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no deflection in his expression. "You are right," he said. Sophie felt her chest tighten slightly, sensing that what came next would change the direction of the night entirely. Alexander folded his hands loosely on the table, his posture relaxed, but his attention fully focused. "I've spent years building systems," he said. "Businesses, organizations, structures that are meant to serve people. But systems only reflect the values of the people inside them." Sophie listened carefully, her earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to understanding. "And you think something is wrong," she said. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to reveal the truth behind his calm exterior. "I know it is," he replied. Sophie glanced around the restaurant again, seeing it now not just as a place, but as part of something larger, something that extended far beyond this single room. "So you walk in pretending to be invisible," she said, slowly piecing it together to see how people really act when they believe no one important is watching. Alexander nodded once. "Exactly." Sophie leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "And tonight, what did you see?" she asked. Alexander held her gaze, unwavering. "I saw how quickly people decide who deserves respect," he said, "and how rarely that decision is based on anything real." The words were not loud, but they carried a truth that resonated beyond the table. Sophie felt it settle deep within her, connecting with something she had experienced but never fully articulated. And then Alexander added, his voice softer now, almost reflective, "I also saw something I was not expecting." Sophie's heart skipped slightly. "What is that?" she asked. Alexander did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, not as a subject of observation, not as a variable in a test, but as a person who had disrupted the pattern he had come to expect. "Consistency," he said finally. "Not just a moment, not just a reaction, but a choice you were willing to repeat, even when it became uncomfortable." Sophie felt a quiet warmth rise in her chest, unexpected and unfamiliar. It was not pride. It was something steadier, something that felt like being seen without being judged. And in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted once more. This was no longer a test. It was the beginning of something neither of them had planned, something that extended beyond the boundaries of the night, beyond the walls of the restaurant, into a space where choices carried consequences, and where kindness was no longer invisible. The word consistency did not fade when Alexander Cole said it. It stayed, with Sophie Bennett, echoing quietly beneath every sound in the restaurant, shaping the way she now saw everything around her. What had once felt like a simple dinner had turned into something far more deliberate, something that carried weight beyond the table they sat at. Sophie looked at him carefully, studying not just his words, but the intention behind them. "You're not just observing anymore," she said slowly. "You are deciding something." Alexander did not deny it. His expression remained calm, but there was a clarity in his gaze now, a direction that had not been there before. "I am," he said. Sophie felt her chest tighten slightly, sensing the shift in the conversation, the way it was no longer about the room or the people around them, but about her. "What kind of decision?" she asked. Alexander leaned forward just enough to close the distance between them, his voice lowering, becoming more personal, more direct. "I am building something new," he said. "Not another company, not another system that looks good from the outside, but fails in the details. Something that changes how people are treated at every level." Sophie frowned slightly, tried to understand. "That sounds like a lot bigger than one restaurant," she said. "It is," Alexander replied. "This is only one piece." Sophie glanced around again, seeing the place differently now, not just as a restaurant, but as part of a larger structure, a network shaped by decisions made far above the people working within it. "And where do I fit into that?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. Alexander held her gaze, unwavering. "That is exactly what I am deciding," he said. The words landed with quiet intensity. Sophie felt a mix of disbelief and resistance rise inside her. "You do not even know me," she said. "I know what you did," Alexander replied. "And more importantly, I know that you did not stop when it became uncomfortable." Sophie shook her head slightly, a small, almost defensive motion. "That does not qualify me for anything," she said. It qualifies you for something most people never are, he said. Trust. The word felt heavier than anything else he had said that night. Sophie leaned back slightly, absorbing it, but also pushing against it. You're talking about changing systems, she said. That requires experience, skills, education. Not just one decision at a dinner table. Alexander nodded once, acknowledging her point. You are right, he said, but systems do not fail because people lack skill. They fail because people forget why they exist in the first place. Sophie fell silent for a moment, his words settling deeper than she expected. She thought about her own life, the job she had taken, the way she had been treated in places where she felt invisible, replaceable, easy to overlook. And she thought about how quickly that same treatment could be justified, ignored, or dismissed as normal. You think I would not forget? She said quietly. Alexander's answer came without hesitation. I think you have already proven that you will not, he said. The certainty in his voice left no room for doubt, and that unsettled her more than anything else. The young couple at the table had finished their meal, their earlier tension replaced with quiet gratitude. They thanked Sophie again before preparing to leave, their movements lighter, their expressions different from when they had first walked in. Sophie watched them go, feeling something shift inside her, something that connected directly to what Alexander was saying. You are offering me something, she said slowly, turning back to him. Yes, Alexander replied. A chance to be part of something that actually matters. Sophie let out a slow breath, her mind racing, weighing the reality of her life against the possibility he was presenting. And what if I say no, she asked. Alexander did not look surprised. Then nothing changes for me, he said. But everything stays the same for you. The honesty in his answer caught her off guard. There was no pressure in his tone, no manipulation, just a clear statement of truth. Sophie looked down at the table, at the empty chair beside her, at the place where this entire night had begun. That seat had started as something small, something almost insignificant. Now it felt like a turning point. When do I have to decide? She asked quietly. Alexander leaned back again, his posture relaxed, but his eyes still focused on her. You already are, he said, with every choice you make next. And in that moment, Sophie realized that this was no longer about an offer waiting in the future. It had already begun. It had begun the moment she chose to make space for someone else. And now, she had to decide what. That choice was truly worth. The restaurant had begun to settle again, but for Sophie Bennett, nothing felt settled anymore. The conversation with Alexander Cole lingered in her mind, not as a simple offer, but as something far more complicated, something that challenged the structure of her entire life. She sat there for a moment, staring at the table, at the small details that had once felt ordinary, now carrying a strange weight. The empty chair beside her, the folded napkin, the faint reflection of the overhead lights on the polished surface. Everything felt like a reminder of a decision she had not yet made, but was already living through. Across from her, Alexander watched quietly, giving her space, but not withdrawing his presence. He understood the silence. He expected it. You're thinking about what this costs you, he said after a moment, his voice calm, not intrusive. Sophie looked up at him, her expression honest, unguarded. Yes, she said, because it is not just about saying yes. It is about everything that comes after. Alexander nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in her words. Change always comes with a cost, he said. The question is whether the cost of staying the same is greater. Sophie let out a slow breath, her mind moving through the reality she knew so well. Early mornings, late shifts, bills that never seemed to stop, a life built on careful choices and limited margins. And now, suddenly, there was something else in front of her. Something uncertain, something bigger, something that did not come with guarantees. You make it sound simple, she said quietly. Alexander shook his head. It is not simple, he replied. That is why most people never do it. The honesty in his voice made it harder to dismiss. Sophie glanced around the restaurant again, but this time, she was not looking at the people or the staff. She was looking at the system he had described, the invisible structure that shaped every interaction, every decision, every judgment made in that room, and she realized something that unsettled her. She had been living inside that system her entire life without questioning it, until tonight, and now she could not unsee it. The manager approached once more, but this time his tone was careful, measured in a different way. "Mr. Cole," he said, lowering his voice, "we have prepared a private space. Should you wish to continue your evening there, it would offer more privacy for your discussion." Alexander looked at him briefly, then shook his head. "This is where the conversation belongs," he said. The manager hesitated, then nodded, stepping away once again, though the tension in his posture remained. Sophie watched the exchange, then turned back to Alexander. "You are not hiding this," she said. "No," he replied. "If something is worth changing, it should not be hidden." Sophie felt that settle inside her, connecting with something she had always believed but rarely acted on. Before she could respond, a quiet disturbance rippled through the restaurant once more. This time, it was not subtle. A woman at a nearby table stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is unacceptable," she said sharply, her voice carrying across the room. "I did not come here to dine in a place that allows this kind of behavior." Every eye turned again. The tension returned, sharper now, more direct. The line that had been quietly challenged earlier was now being openly defended. Sophie felt her heart begin to race, but she did not look away. The manager moved quickly toward the woman, attempting to calm the situation, but the damage was already done. The room had split. Some watched in silence. Some avoided looking altogether. And some, like the woman, made their judgment clear. Sophie glanced at Alexander, expecting him to step in, to assert his authority, to end the situation the way someone in his position easily could. But he did not move. He simply watched, waiting, not for the room, for her. Sophie felt the weight of that realization immediately. This was the moment. Not a private decision, not a quiet agreement, but a public choice. The kind that could not be undone or explained away later. She stood slowly, her chair moving back with a soft sound that somehow carried through the tension. Her hands were steady, even if her heart was not. She turned toward the woman, her voice calm but firm. "They are not doing anything wrong," she said. The woman scoffed, her expression sharp. "That is not the point," she replied. Sophie took a step forward, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. "Then what is the point?" she asked. The question hung in the air, direct and unfiltered. The woman hesitated, caught off guard, but only for a moment. "The point is standards," she said. "This place has standards." Sophie nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. "Then maybe the standards need to change," she replied. The room went still, completely still, and in that silence, Sophie realized that the decision she had been struggling with was no longer a question in her mind. It had already been made, not in words, but in action, and across the room, Alexander Cole watched her, not with curiosity anymore, not with evaluation, but with something far more certain. She had chosen. The silence that followed Sophie Bennett's words did not break right away. It expanded, filling every corner of the restaurant, pressing against every person in the room, forcing them to sit with what had just been said. Maybe the standards need to change. The sentence did not sound loud, but it carried a weight that no one could ignore. The woman who had spoken before stood frozen for a moment. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and offense, as if she had expected resistance, but not calm defiance. Around her, the room shifted again, not in chaos, but in awareness. People were no longer simply observing. They were choosing where they stood. The manager stepped forward quickly, his voice controlled but urgent as he tried to contain the situation. "Miss, we want all of our guests to feel comfortable," he said carefully, glancing between Sophie and the woman, attempting to balance two opposing expectations without upsetting either. But the balance had already been broken. Sophie did not step back. She did not soften her position. She remained where she was, grounded in a decision she now fully understood. "Comfort for who?" she asked, her voice steady, not raised, but clear enough to reach beyond the immediate space. The manager hesitated, his rehearsed responses no longer sufficient. The woman let out a sharp breath, shaking her head as if dismissing the entire situation. "This is ridiculous," she said. "I will not stay here." She reached for her coat, her movements sharp, final. But as she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. No one followed her. Not the couple at the next table. Not the man in the press suit. Not the group near the window who had been quietly watching. They remained seated, their silence no longer passive but intentional. The woman paused briefly, sensing the lack of support, then continued toward the exit, her heels striking the floor with quick, decisive steps before the door closed behind her. The sound echoed softly, marking the end of something. The room did not erupt into applause. There was no dramatic reaction. Instead, there was a subtle shift, a release of tension that had been building beneath the surface. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, quieter, more thoughtful. Sophie stood there for a moment longer, her heart still racing, her hands steady despite it. She had not planned this. She had not prepared for it. But she had not backed down. Slowly, she returned to her seat, her eyes briefly meeting Alexander Cole's. He had not moved during the entire exchange. He had not intervened, had not spoken, had not used his position to control the outcome. He had simply watched. And now, there was no ambiguity in his expression. "You did not choose the easier path," he said quietly. Sophie let out a slow breath, the weight of the moment settling over her. "It did not feel easier," she admitted. Alexander nodded slightly. "It never is," he replied. The manager approached again, but this time his demeanor had changed completely. There was no hesitation, no conflict in his posture. He stood straighter, his voice clear, directed not just at Alexander, but at Sophie as well. "If there is anything we can do to improve your experience tonight, please let us know," he said. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them had shifted. It was no longer about managing a problem. It was about acknowledging a change. Sophie nodded politely, but her attention had already moved beyond the moment. She looked around the room again, seeing it with new clarity. Nothing about the space had physically changed. The same tables, the same lighting, the same menu. But something else had. The way people carried themselves. The way they looked at one another. The invisible rules that had once gone unquestioned had been challenged, and now they were no longer invisible. "You said systems reflect people," Sophie said, turning back to Alexander. Alexander inclined his head slightly. "They do," he replied. Sophie held his gaze, her voice steady, certain. "Then maybe people can change them faster than we think." Alexander did not respond immediately. He studied her for a moment, then allowed a small, genuine smile to appear, the first one that felt completely unguarded. "That is exactly what I was hoping to see," he said. Sophie felt a quiet shift inside her, something settling into place, something that no longer felt uncertain. The offer he had made earlier was still there, but it no longer felt like a question she needed to answer. It felt like a direction she had already begun to move toward. And as the night continued, the table where everything had started remained the same, yet completely different, a place where a single decision had turned into something far greater than anyone in that room had expected. The energy in the restaurant no longer felt fragile. It felt settled, as if something invisible had shifted into place and refused to return to what it had been before. Sophie Bennett sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of everything that had just happened move through her, not overwhelming, but steady, grounding. Across from her, Alexander Cole no longer observed with distance. He was present now, fully engaged, as though the line between evaluation and belief had already been crossed. The noise of the room returned in layers, soft conversations, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of a space finding its rhythm again. But beneath it all, there was something different, a subtle awareness that had not been there before. Sophie exhaled slowly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice calm, no longer uncertain, but not rushed either. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful, deliberate. "Now, we see if this continues beyond tonight," he said. Sophie held his gaze, understanding the meaning behind the words. This was not about a single moment anymore. It was about what came after, about whether the choice she had made could exist outside the controlled environment of one evening, one place, one situation. "You want to know if this is who I really am?" she said. Alexander nodded once. "Not just who you are," he replied, "but what you are willing to do with it." The distinction mattered. Sophie felt it immediately. She had already shown him something. Now he was asking what she would build from it. The waiter approached again, this time with a quiet confidence, his earlier uncertainty gone. He placed a small leather folder on the table, then paused, his attention shifting between Sophie and Alexander with a subtle respect that no longer felt forced. "Whenever you are ready," he said, his tone even, professional. Sophie glanced at the folder, then back at Alexander. The moment felt symbolic in a way she had not expected. Earlier, the bill would have been a simple transaction. Now it felt like a transition point, the end of one version of the evening and the beginning of something else. Alexander did not reach for it. Instead, he looked at Sophie. "This part matters too," he said quietly. Sophie frowned slightly. "Paying the bill?" she asked, almost amused. Alexander's expression remained serious. "Responsibility," he clarified, "not just for yourself, but for the space you choose to influence." Sophie looked down at the folder again, then slowly reached for it. Her hands were steady as she opened it, scanning the total, not with anxiety, but with awareness. This was familiar territory. This was her world. And yet, even this felt different now. She placed her card inside without hesitation and closed the folder. The waiter took it with a nod, his expression respectful, then stepped away. Alexander watched her closely. "You did not hesitate," he said. Sophie gave a small shrug. "I am used to covering what I can," she replied. Alexander shook his head slightly. "That is not what I meant," he said. Sophie looked at him, waiting. "You did not assume I would take care of it," he continued. "You did not step back once the situation became easier." Sophie considered that for a moment, then spoke simply. "That was never the point," she said. Alexander's gaze softened, not with pity or approval, but with recognition. "Exactly," he said. The word carried weight, not as an agreement, but as confirmation. The waiter returned with the receipt, placing it gently on the table. Sophie signed it without looking at the final number again, then closed the folder and handed it back. Another small action, another choice, and Alexander saw it for what it was. Consistency. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his decision clear. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I want you to come to my office." Sophie blinked, the shift direct, immediate. "Your office," she repeated. Alexander nodded. "I will have my assistant give you the address," he said. "We will talk about what this could become, not just in theory, but in practice." Sophie felt a flicker of hesitation, not doubt, but the awareness of what stepping into that world would mean. "And if I do not come?" she asked. Alexander met her gaze evenly. "Then tonight remains what it was," he said. A moment. Sophie held his gaze for a long second, the weight of the choice clear in her mind. Then she nodded once, not quickly, not impulsively, but with quiet certainty. "I will be there," she said. Alexander did not smile immediately. He simply watched her, as if confirming that the decision was real, that it was grounded, that it was not driven by the intensity of the evening alone. Then, slowly he nodded. "Good," he said. And in that moment, the night that had started with a single empty chair reached its next turning point, not as an ending, but as the beginning of something neither of them could fully see yet, but both had already chosen to step into. The night did not end with noise or spectacle. It ended quietly, almost gently, as if the weight of what had happened could only settle in silence. Sophie Bennett stepped out of the restaurant into the cool evening air, the city stretching out around her in familiar lights and distant sounds. But nothing felt quite the same anymore. The door closed softly behind her, and for a moment, she simply stood there, her breath slow, her thoughts catching up to everything that had unfolded inside. The street was calm, a few cars passing, the glow of streetlights reflecting against the pavement. It was the same city she had walked through every day, the same sidewalks, the same routine waiting for her tomorrow. And yet, Something inside her had shifted in a way she could not ignore. She reached into her pocket and felt the small receipt folded there. The simple record of a meal that had turned into something far greater than a transaction. It was a reminder, a marker, a beginning. Behind her, the restaurant windows reflected a world she had just stepped out of, but the reflection felt distant now, as if she had already crossed into something new. She started walking, her steps steady, her mind replaying the moments of the night, the hesitation, the choice, the confrontation, the offer. Each piece fitting together into something that felt less like coincidence and more like direction. At the corner, she paused, glancing back once, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. That table, that chair, that decision, they were no longer just part of a single evening. They were part of who she was becoming. The next morning came faster than she expected. The early light filtered through her window, soft but persistent, pulling her out of a sleep that had not been restless, but had not been entirely peaceful either. Sophie sat up slowly, her first thought not about work, not about bills, not about the usual weight of her routine, but about the conversation she had agreed to continue. For a moment, she considered the easier path, staying where things were known, predictable, manageable. But the thought did not settle the way it used to. It felt smaller now. She stood, moving through her morning with quiet focus, choosing her clothes carefully, not for appearance, but for presence. This was not about fitting into a world she did not belong to. It was about stepping into a space she had already begun to shape. The address Alexander had given her was clear, direct, located in a part of the city she had only seen from a distance. When she arrived, the building rose in clean lines of glass and steel, reflecting the sky above, imposing but not unreachable. She stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in the scale of it, the quiet movement of people inside, the subtle order of a place built on decisions made far beyond what most ever saw. This was his world, or at least part of it. And now, it was the place she had chosen to walk into. She stepped forward. Inside, the lobby was expansive, polished, filled with natural light that softened the edges of its structure. People moved with purpose, conversations low, focused, each step aligned with something larger. Sophie approached the front desk, her voice steady as she spoke his name. There was no hesitation in the response this time, no questioning of her presence. She was expected. The assistant who greeted her carried the same quiet professionalism she had seen the night before, but without the tension, without the uncertainty. This was a place where roles were clear, where systems were defined. And yet, Sophie knew now that even here, those systems were shaped by people. And people could change. She was led through the building, past glass walls and open spaces, into an office that overlooked the city below. The view stretched wide, a reminder of scale, of reach, of influence. Alexander Cole stood near the window, his posture relaxed, his attention shifting as she entered. There was no surprise in his expression, only recognition, as if her arrival confirmed something he had already decided. "You came," he said simply. Sophie nodded once, stepping fully into the room. "I said I would," she replied. Alexander studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the chair across from him, the same subtle invitation as the night before, but now in a different world, under different circumstances. Sophie moved forward and sat down, her posture steady, her presence grounded. The chair felt different from the one in the restaurant, but the meaning behind it did not. It was still about choice, still about space, still about what came next. And, as Alexander took his seat across from her, the distance between them no longer felt like a divide of status or position. It felt like the beginning of something built on something far more rare. Not power, not advantage, but understanding. And in that quiet office, high above the city that had shaped them both in different ways, the decision that had started with a single empty chair reached its next form. Not as a test, not as an offer, but as a path that was now real, now possible, and no longer something either of them could pretend not to see. The office was quiet, but not empty. It carried the kind of silence that came from purpose, not absence. Sophie Bennett sat across from Alexander Cole. the city stretching endlessly behind him through the glass walls, a reminder of how much influence one person could hold and how much of it often went unseen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what had already been set in motion did not need to be rushed. Finally, Alexander reached toward the table beside him and slid a thin folder across the desk toward her. Inside was not a contract filled with restrictions or complicated terms. It was something far simpler. A proposal. A new division within his company focused entirely on restructuring customer experience and internal culture, starting from the ground level. Restaurants. Service teams. Front-facing interactions. Places where people were judged in seconds without a second thought. And at the top of the page, one line stood out. Director of Human Experience. Sophie looked up, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "You are serious," she said quietly. Alexander did not hesitate. "Completely," he replied. Sophie let out a slow breath, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the folder, not opening it yet. "You're offering me something people spend years trying to earn," she said. Alexander nodded once. "I'm offering you something people spend years forgetting how to deserve," he corrected. The words settled between them, steady, undeniable. Sophie finally opened the folder, scanning the outline, the responsibilities, the vision behind it. It was not about managing people. It was about changing how they were seen, how they were treated, how decisions were made when no one believed it mattered. And suddenly, everything from the night before connected with what was in front of her now. This was not a reward. It was a responsibility. "If I accept this," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful, "this does not stay in this office. This goes everywhere. Every location. Every team. Every person." Alexander leaned back slightly, a faint smile forming, not of amusement, but of recognition. "That is the point," he said. Sophie closed the folder gently, her decision already clear in her eyes before she even spoke. "Then I'm not doing this alone," she said. Alexander raised an eyebrow slightly. "Explain," he replied. Sophie leaned forward, her voice steady, grounded in the same certainty she had found the night before. "The people who live inside these systems need to be part of changing them. Not just leadership, not just executives. Everyone, from the front door to the back office." Alexander watched her carefully, then nodded once, slowly. "That is exactly why I chose you," he said. Sophie held his gaze, not as someone stepping into his world, but as someone prepared to reshape it with him. "Then let us do it right," she said. And just like that, the decision was no longer a possibility. It was real. The weeks that followed did not unfold easily. Change never did. There was resistance, doubt, people who believed nothing needed to change, others who feared what change might take away from them. But Sophie did not step back. She visited locations, spoke with staff, listened more than she spoke, creating spaces where voices that had been ignored for years were finally heard. And slowly, something began to shift. Not perfectly, not all at once, but steadily, the way real change always did. Months later, in that same restaurant where everything had begun, a small plaque appeared near the entrance. It was simple, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. Reserved for every person who deserves a place. No taitas. No conditions. Just a quiet reminder. One evening, Sophie stood outside that restaurant again, not as someone uncertain of where she belonged, but as someone who had helped redefine what belonging meant. Alexander joined her, standing beside her, not above, not ahead, but equal. "You changed more than a system," he said quietly. Sophie shook her head slightly, a small smile forming. "No," she replied. "We did." Alexander looked at her, and for the first time, there was nothing left to test, nothing left to prove. Only something real, something built on choice, on consistency, on a moment that had been repeated until it became something permanent. He extended his hand slightly, not as an offer of power, but as a gesture of partnership. Sophie took it without hesitation. And in that simple act, the story that had begun with one empty chair reached its true ending. Not as a coincidence, not as a test, but as proof that one decision, when repeated with intention, could change not just one life, but many, and turned something as small as a seat at a table into something that truly mattered.